This episode is brought to you by 1Password. Imagine what your brain could remember if it didn't have to hold on to 100 different passwords. Free your brain from remembering passwords. Get 1Password. 1Password combines industry-leading security with award-winning design to bring private, secure, and user-friendly password management to everyone. Don't let security slow your business down. Go to onepassword.com/technews to start your 2-week free trial.
Looking for a pickup truck to get just about anything done? Look no further. The Chevy Silverado EV isn't just the most powerful Silverado ever, with next-level towing capability and technology. It also offers game-changing versatility with the available multi-flex midgate and tailgate, which means Silverado EV helps you carry large, bulky, and oddly shaped items up to nearly 11 feet in length. Chevrolet. Together, let's drive. Visit Chevrolet.com to learn more.
And this is the Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN TV. I'm your host, Peter Slen. Thanks for being with us. This week, we sit down with Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan to talk about politics, culture, history, and her newest book, A Certain Idea of America. That podcast begins in a moment.
Make your Giving Tuesday donation go twice as far. This year, you can double the impact of your gift to C-SPAN and support unfiltered access to your government. A generous C-SPAN supporter has pledged to match the first $10,000 in donations, meaning every dollar you give will be matched, making your contribution go twice as far. By supporting C-SPAN, you ensure transparent, unfiltered access to your government. Our no commentary, no spin coverage allows you to make up your own mind. Don't wait for Giving Tuesday. Make your impact today. Donate now at cspan.org/donate, and your contribution will be matched dollar for dollar. Visit cspan.org/donate today to help keep democracy unfiltered. Thank you.
Well, Pulitzer Prize winner Peggy Noonan has written the Declarations column in the Wall Street Journal for decades. She is published every Saturday. In her latest book, A Certain Idea of America, which is a compendium of past columns, the former Reagan speechwriter talks about politics and culture, Taylor Swift, the media, and what the American dream is to her. Our conversation begins now. Peggy Noonan's newest book is called A Certain Idea of America. There's about 80 columns in this book, ranging from Nixon to Robespierre to Oscar Hammerstein, to politicians, etc. How did you choose what to put in?
I went through about just more than 400 columns that I'd written over the past few years, and I and an editor started to go through them, and the ones we picked were the ones that were most fun and most alive, and we assumed there would be a lot of political columns, and there are certainly political columns, but actually we found ourselves most interested in history, in issues of history and culture. We were most interested in fun and liveliness. And when I said something like, "Oh, I loved writing that," she'd say, "It's in." And when she'd say, "I really loved that one," I'd look and I'd think, "That's in." So I had the most fun, and she loved it, so we put it together.
Would it be easy to write a weekly column about Donald Trump?
About only Donald Trump? No, because you would repeat yourself a lot, you know? Trump is an interesting and unique political figure. He presents himself in certain ways. You can describe them, you can guess at things, but Trump is Trump. And once you've sort of grokked that and written about him, then you delve into repetition. Now, repetition is not the worst thing. When you think a point is important, repeat it and repeat it again. Don't be embarrassed to if you think it must be underlined. Not all the same people are reading you every week, so sometimes you repeat something, you're talking to new folk. But do not repeat yourself endlessly. Do not become boorish, you know? Sort of, you must lay off on your obsessions sometimes.
Well, I just picked out a couple of quotes about Donald Trump that I want to, from your columns. Donald Trump is binding himself down with thick cords of rhetorical inadequacy. He's a nut, and you know he's a nut. I don't like the SOB. I think him a bad man who'll cause and bungle crises almost from day one. Are you a so-called never-Trumper?
I've never thought of myself that way. I started out very sympathetic with Donald Trump in terms of policy, and also sympathetic for what he represented in history, which was back in 2015 and 2016, kind of upsetting and overturning a political establishment that, in my view, had grown encrusted, who'd given us disaster after disaster, who, both parties together, were cynical. Both parties together didn't want to deal for 20 years with the growing chaos at the border. So when Trump came by, I thought, good, he is a rebuke to a system badly in need of it. But fairly, the column you mentioned that begins actually at the first sentence of the column is, he's a nut and you know he's a nut. However, that column was written with a sort of poignant feeling on my part because I agreed with him so much on issues, but I felt he did not have the essential nature of an American president and of a steady leader who could deliver what must be delivered. So that was my judgment. And by the end of his first term, I'd kind of lost my temper with him on January 6th. But he's an interesting figure, a powerful figure, and he has put his imprint on the age.
In one of your columns, you talk about the 5 stages of Trump: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Yeah, that was early on. I think that might have been from 2015. I was surrounded everywhere. I was bumping into Republicans who were at some point, I realized it was the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of death that I was seeing, which starts with, this couldn't be, and then goes to, well, maybe if we do such and such, this won't happen, and then goes to, well, maybe there's something good here. So yeah, I did see the 5 stages of grief being worked out largely by people who never thought they would be upended, and who were shocked by it, and who were trying to simply explain it to themselves. Did you have election anxiety or exhaustion in this last round? Oh, that's so interesting. I think in the 2015-16 cycle, it was so uncallable. And there was I think we all entered a kind of stage of hypervigilance where you would get up every morning and actually check the news, not with a feeling of, oh, what happened overnight? Maybe there was an earthquake in Japan, but with, oh no, what now? A certain alarm. I don't think I felt all that as much in the 2020 or 2024 cycles. I have members of my family who are very pro-Trump and who would talk to me about him. And I started to feel through them that he just might pull this off. And I also, the smartest person I know writing about politics, took me aside once in the spring or the summer. And I was thinking, Trump's going to win this. And he said, no, he may win it by a landslide. And it was so shocking to me that an extremely intelligent person was sort of going down the path I was going down, but even farther than I was going down. So I didn't have a feeling of shock, and I guess I felt I kind of understood it. Can you tell us who that person is? I don't want to, because I think he'd be so embarrassed. Peggy Noonan, where did you grow up, and how did you grow up? I was born in Brooklyn, New York. If you've ever seen the movie Brooklyn, the Brooklyn I was born into, and which
from which I got my actual first memories as a person on Earth, are in that movie. That's how buildings look. That's how the sidewalk looks, how people on the street look. So born in Brooklyn, we moved out to Long Island when I was 5, as many Brooklyn and Bronx and Queens folks did. We picked up the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens and brought them out to those little houses in Long Island. My parents bought a house for $14,990 in 1955 in Massapequa, Long Island. So we lived in Massapequa and Massapequa Park. In one of those little houses, I think the Levitt Company, of course he invented Levittown, but I think the Levitt Company built the house we were in. I grew up, we lived there for 10 years, then we moved on to northern New Jersey, to Rutherford, New Jersey, and I finished high school there. My family was large, 9 people, economically stressed, turbulent, full of stress, actually. I hate to say dysfunction because it's been the most boring word in America for 20 years, but really a sort of a thing that didn't work, I guess, is what we all felt we came from at the end. But I have so many happy memories of childhood, in part because, like many such folk, working class or lower middle class, we had the TV on all of the time. And it was on, from 7 in the morning through somebody would think to turn it off at midnight, or maybe not. It was always on. We were always watching it. If you were always watching movies in the 50s and 60s, what you were really watching was stations that had no money for programming, no money for a conversation like this. What did they do to fill time? They showed the movies in the 1930s and 40s and 50s made in America. I just watched those movies all the time, and I love them. And I kind of think that they had something to do with the development of my mind and of my attitudes. As in, those movies were written by the fabulous old socialists who wound up getting in trouble in the McCarthy era. So they were chased in the 50s and 60s and beat up quite badly. But they did wonderful movies that were kind of class conscious, but not in a horrible mechanical way or an ideological way, but in a subtle way that showed you class in America. They were early on to talk about race and racial injustice. They were really wonderful, and they had really something to do with how I saw America, which is as a place that was fabulous and fantastic and interesting, and so much is going on in it. But also, it's always trying to make itself better. It's always trying to make itself good. And it's always trying to have fun. So those things were really wonderful. And between movies and books as a child, I made it through. I did not go to college after high school. No college would have me. I was a terrible student. I almost didn't get out of high school. We were marked on you had to have a certain amount of credits, like 18 credits a year to get out of junior or senior year. And I did not have enough credits unless I passed a specific course that I was failing in, a chemistry course that I barely managed to pass, passing a final with like 68. The grade was like 68. Anyway, I was a terrible student. I missed school a lot. I watched TVs. I'd like to take off from school. I watched TV all day, and then at night I'd read novels. And so I didn't really feel like going to school. Anyway, bad high school student, worked for 2 years as a clerk in the insurance business and also as a waitress, which is a job I look back on with great affection, because waitress is a great job. If you can do it, if you're young enough to do it, it's a hard job. But it was a great job. Anyway, I made my way through the next few years, went to Fairleigh Dickinson University at night. I had a feeling. I actually thought I had a destiny. I thought I was a writer, even though I did not appear to be a writer, and I was not getting educated, but I had a feeling I was a writer, and I had a feeling of destiny. So I started Fairleigh Dickinson University at night, did very well. I went after work, took the Spanish courses I had never taken in high school, and stuff like that, and I think some math courses and science courses, and then went to Fairleigh Dickinson in New Jersey, in Rutherford, New Jersey then, and did fine. Oh my gosh, that's a long answer to a short question, but there you are.
But before we leave your family, there's another Noonan who's pretty well known, a Jimmy Noonan. Is he related to you?
Jimmy Noonan, the actor? Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes, I have a brother named Jimmy who is an actor and who is a hilarious person and who lives in Jersey. And how do you know Jimmy?
I don't know Jimmy. I know of Jimmy.
How? Through?
Well, he's quite well known. He's pretty well known in some circles, so just wanted to make that connection. What was your first political job?
Writing in the speechwriting department for Ronald Reagan.
How did you go from Fairleigh Dickinson waitressing to the speechwriting department of the White House?
Graduated college in 1974, knew I was a writer, but didn't know where I would ever fit in as a writer. I loved reading newspaper columns, so I went to New York newspapers and said, "Hi, could I be a writer? You know, I'll start anywhere, but I'd really like to be a columnist." And they laughed and they said, "Honey, New York is where you end up if you've done well. New York is not really where you start out." And I thought, oh, around this time, I had just graduated college. A friend of mine wrote me a note from Boston. She had just lost her roommate. That's data point one. Data point two is, after college, the way I was making my living was as a temporary secretary. There were I don't know if there are still temporary secretary agencies, but executives in the old days would have a secretary, and the secretary might go on vacation for a month or might leave and have a baby, and they needed a temporary secretary to hold down the job and answer the phone. I had a bunch of temporary secretary jobs. One was at the CBS Broadcast Center in New York, so I took the bus in every day from Jersey. And at the CBS Broadcast Center in New York, I was working for a fellow who worked in the union relations area. He was a great guy. And there were women in the office, and they'd sit around chatting sometimes, and they'd look at me and say, "What do you want to do?" And I'd say, "I want to be a writer." And one of those women said, "CBS is starting an all-news radio station in Boston, and they realize they don't have enough writers because they need the writers to fill 24 hours of copy." And she said, "I know the guy who runs that radio station. You should call him, see if you can get an interview." So I called him. I got an interview. Wrote to my friend who was living in Boston, and I said, "I'm going to come up and take your roommate's place." I literally packed a trunk. Of the odd things in your life as you look back, I didn't pack a bag for a week or a few weeks. I got an old trunk and put everything I had in the trunk and took the train to Boston, got my interview, which was not an interview, it was a tryout. They sat me down at a desk. They gave me wire copy from AP, UPI, and Reuters, and they said, "Write a news show." I didn't know how to write a news show. And I thought, what am I going to do now? How do I find the lead, this, that? Suddenly I realized the sound of the WEEI news radio was being pumped through the newsroom. You could hear what was on the air now. So I listened and I thought, well, they're pretty interested in President Ford did such and such today. I'll get out the Ford piece out of the AP copy. And I wrote a Ford story. Then I wrote something else. Then I wrote something else. I called it a newscast. News director came in and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm taking a writing audition." He said, "What do you have?" He looked at it and he said, "Okay, you're hired." The reason he did that is a writer had just quit to go off to a radio station in Rhode Island. Anyway, so I got my first job and it was fabulous. It taught me to write for air. It taught me to be a journalist. it taught me it made me able to call up the cops in Somerville and say, you know, on the local wire, there's talk of a really bad car accident. Were a lot of people killed? Was anybody killed? What are you doing? And they'd give me the facts. And I'd write it up into a local news story. And then I got to the point where I could call the local senators and the governor and say, what's happening here? And write it into a story. So that was fabulous. It built my confidence, made it possible for me to call people and say, please talk to me. I'm representing a radio station. And how to get information, how to be careful about it. And just how to, I had always, when I was in college, I became the editor of the student newspaper, the Fairleigh Dickinson Spectator. And I wrote the editorials. And I was a reader by nature, and I read all the local newspapers, but I was a print person. I was words absorbed by the eye. I had never been a words absorbed by the ear person. And I had to learn that real quick, and learn that a sentence that you give an anchor on the noon to 1 p.m. hour, that first sentence of his report, that first sentence cannot go 5 lines and have clauses and commas and semicolons. Do you know what I mean? It's quicker and straighter. Blunter is not the word. It can be very subtle. But you're delivering information in a way that is more conversational than literary in a printed matter sort of way. So learning that took me a while. I was aware I had a lot to learn, and I tried to learn, and I did.
Blinds.com is kicking off the savings early with Black Friday mega deals all month long. A Blinds.com design expert can help you make the perfect selection on your schedule. We can even handle everything from measure to your whole home installed for just one low cost. With over 25 million windows covered, Blinds.com is the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings. Get up to 45% off site-wide and a free professional measure right now at Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
How'd you get to Washington? Ronald Reagan.
This is the mid-70s. In that time, I was becoming politically, shockingly conservative. I was reading National Review. I'd been reading National Review for a while. We were in the middle, the Boston I came to was in the middle of the busing crisis. The America I was involved in was in the middle of the Vietnam crisis. And I found myself naturally taking the conservative side on these issues. I watched all the conservatives running around in America. They were fine. But I wasn't, I was not a registered Republican. I was just a person with thoughts. After a few years in Boston, I went down to be a news writer at the CBS Broadcast Center, where I had been a temporary secretary. And there, the most wonderful thing happened to me. This is now, we're getting later in the 70s. The guys, I was on the radio side. I'd started on radio, and they kept me in radio, and I was fine. But the guys who were on radio side at CBS News in the 1970s were the guys who had invented writing for broadcast with Ed Murrow. They were the Murrow boys. Charles Collingwood was still there. Richard C. Hoddle, Douglas Edwards, they were my colleagues in that newsroom. And I listened to how they put things, and I listened to what they thought a story was. We had the great Charles Osgood, also not a Murrow guy, a much younger man, but a kind of genius. Anyway, I learned so much from them. Finally, I graduated to Walter Cronkite was the anchor of the CBS News. He had a radio show. Every day he did a radio commentary. It was written by a wonderful writer named Dale Miner. When Dale Miner was off on vacation, I became one of the people who filled in for him. Once when I was filling in for Dale Miner, who was writing for Cronkite, Cronkite himself took vacation, and this young guy named Dan Rather came in. So I wound up writing for him. Then Dan became the anchor at CBS, and I became his daily radio writer of his commentaries, which was a fabulous job and was like doing a column every day. It was like a 4.5-minute show, and 4 minutes of it was copy. And it was a column. It was, "Hi, I'm Dan Rather. This is what's happening. This is what I think of it. These are the questions we ought to be asking." So it was very demanding, but excellent. And I was a conservative and he was a liberal. I think he'd fairly say that at this point, though he didn't used to say it then. And between a conservative and a liberal, we had a show that I just think was so good and fair, and I think it had kind of, as a rule, a kind of generous feel to it, and not full of judgment. It started out awkwardly, but in time I think it became good. Anyway, whenever visiting conservatives came through CBS News, like Bill Buckley doing a talk show, or some writer doing the conservative side of a debate show, they would actually be brought by to meet me, as in, "Hi, you should meet Peggy Noonan. She's our conservative," which was very funny. I got to tell you, Peter, I know nostalgia is gauzy, and I know our memories get gauzed up, but I do remember media newsrooms and the media in the 70s as being a little more easygoing about political disagreement, about there's a left and a right and a middle and an up and a down, whatever. But you can all be friends. Anyway, they'd be brought by to meet me, and sometimes there was a writer named Joe Sobran who had a commentary show, and he was a visiting conservative. And he said to me one day, "What is it you want to do? Do you want to stay here and write?" And I said, "No, I want to write speeches for Ronald Reagan. I just think he's terrific. I support him." And he was surprised because he didn't fully understand my political views on things. He mentioned it back. He was also a writer for National Review. He mentioned it back in the office. He mentioned it to a guy who had gone for a speechwriting job with Reagan. He had not gotten the job, but that guy recommended me to the White House and said, "Keep your eye on this one." One day the White House called me. Oh, I know. A wonderful man named Ben Elliott, who was the head of speechwriting for Ronald Reagan. He called me and he said, "I heard about you and I heard you're good, but I'm really calling because," he said, "you may not know this, but 20 years ago, I worked on the 4th floor at the CBS Broadcast Center, and I was the conservative." He said, "So I just wanted to say buck up and good luck to you, and realize you can get through that moment." And then very sweetly, he said, "And if you ever come by Washington, do come by and say hello." And I totally lied, and I said, "Actually, I'm coming by Washington tomorrow." I really just made that up. I was not going to Washington the next day. I said, "I got a business trip. I'm coming by Washington tomorrow. Could I come see you?" And he laughed in my face, knowing that I had just lied. And he said, "Well, I guess yes, you can come see me." So I went to see him, and I said, "This is what I think of Reagan. This is what I think of politics. This is what I think of history. And I want to work for him." And we had long conversations. I had to be interviewed by a lot of people, and I had to show everything I'd ever written at CBS. Why? Because it's a crazy world, and I might have written for Dan Rather, "Ronald Reagan is an idiot, and we really dislike him. He's a son of a gun. We can't stand him." And that would be embarrassing if they hired the person involved with that. But I just showed them everything I'd written, and they just said, "Come on in."
Challenger.
So sorry. I keep going so long in my answers that I am embarrassed.
The Challenger explosion, 1986.
Yeah.
Slip the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Is that you?
That was from a poem by John Gillespie McGee Jr., who was an Air Force flyer in World War II. In 1938, I think in training. He was very eager to get into the war, and he got in early, I think joining Canadian forces. And he was eager to get into the war, and he died in an airplane crash. But before that, he wrote a beautiful poem about the joy of flying called High Flight. How did I know it? Two things happened that day. The Challenger blew up. I thought of that poem when I saw the repeated waving goodbye of the astronauts. There was a tape. Remember that we kept playing that day. We didn't have that much tape. A dreadful disaster had just happened. And the networks kept showing Krista McAuliffe and all the other astronauts waving goodbye before they got on the capsule early that morning. That wave goodbye made me think of High Flight, which I learned in the public schools in a poetry class in 7th grade in Massapequa, Long Island. I thought of it and I knew something. I absolutely knew Ronald Reagan knew that poem. I didn't really know it, but I just felt he did. And I knew that if that perfect phrase, that beautiful phrase, were included, Ronald Reagan would use it if he knew that poem, which it turned out he did. It had been a very important poem to his friend Tyrone Power, and had been a very famous poem during World War II and in the years after. And it happened to be written on a plaque outside Reagan's daughter Patty's school, and he used to sometimes read it and reflect on it in the morning. Anyway, that was quite a day. It was a dreadful day. It started out as a busy day for everybody in the office because the State of the Union address was scheduled for that night. Peter, were you there? Were you a young reporter then?
I was up on Capitol Hill, yeah.
Yeah, so you know about just the suddenness of stuff. We all knew the State of the Union address was coming. So in speech writing, my boss and the people who had written the address were taking last-minute changes and making last-minute additions. I was sitting in my office in the morning, catching up on phone calls and paperwork. I had a TV in my office, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see something happened. I was on the phone, and I could see there was like a flash of smoke or something. And I looked, and I thought, wow, what is that? Like everybody else, nobody knew what had happened when it blew up. They thought, is this some kind of special space shuttle that emits smoke suddenly? Nobody understood it. I put up the sound on the TV, and I heard static. Man, the sound of static in modern media is the sound of shock. That means nobody knows what's happening. That's why nobody's talking. And the open line for mission control from NASA, all static. So I thought, whoa. As the hours unfolded, it became, of course, clear a major disaster has happened, a historic one, the first time we have ever had a moment like this in flight with an astronaut. We'd lost astronauts before in training, but not anything like this. It was awful. The faces of the people in the stands who were the relatives of the people on the ship were just so awful. It just shook you up to see it. At a certain point, I realized, okay, everything was chaos. But I realized, okay, the president is either going to have to talk about this tonight in his State of the Union address, so they'll need an important add-on. And I'm not one of the people busy with the address right now, so I can do it. So I went to my boss's office, the guy who hired me, and I said, Ben, the president's going to have to say something, either in the State of the Union, a few pages, or a separate address, and we don't know. And nobody in the West Wing can tell us anything because they're handling the disaster. And the president's on the phone with NASA, and then he's talking with the Secretary of Defense. Should we go up to DEFCON 2? Because this is a national security story. You know, there was always the sense that the Russians might be aggressive in a moment of weakness, so they had a lot to handle. So I just went to my boss. I said, I'm going to start writing about this and the meaning of this and what happened. I'm going to get the latest information, as I did at CBS. So we got somebody to tear the latest information off the wires. it turns out the president had been meeting with network news anchors around the time that the Challenger blew up, because he was talking to them to give them a pre-show on the State of the Union, on what would be said and what his sense of the most important parts of that address were. President was called out of that meeting, told about the Challenger, watched some of it on TV. President came back to the anchors and talked aloud to them about what had happened and what his feelings were, and they asked him questions. There was a young woman from the National Security Council on the side of the room taking notes. She took notes on everything he said. Went over, smart girl, went over to speechwriting to Ben Elliott and said, "Do you think you guys may be writing something? Because this is what the president said." Ben said, "Go into Peggy." She gave it to me, and that became the center of the address. It all got done. It was all under pressure and pain, that address, and you could see it. You saw the pain on Reagan's face. The president, I think he was a little disappointed somehow. There were no words that were going to be equal to that moment, and there were no words that could help, period. You could only do your best. So he wasn't feeling so great about it when it was over. I could tell the way he looked on TV. And I went home that night not feeling so good. But by the next morning, I didn't come into the office early. I wasn't one of those people in at 7 a.m. I love those people. I'm so impressed by them. But I like to breeze in about 9:15. And I breezed in about 9:15, and there were messages from people like the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, and the Secretary of State, George Shultz, people I'd never met or talked to. And I called them back, and they just said, "We heard you worked with him on that. Good work. You did what needed to be done." And I thought, whoa, what a great thing. How nice of Tip O'Neill, too. I mean, to track down Speaker of the House, a kid in an office in the EOB. And then the president called, and he was very frank. He said, "Boy, that was some kind of day." And he talked about the speech. And he said, "You know, at first, at the end, I felt it just, we hadn't, Reagan didn't say this, but what he was communicating to me was that he thought what Lincoln thought when a speech didn't work. He would say it didn't scour." That was a term from plowing on a farm. If you've got a good plow, it scours the earth and does what needs to be done so good planting can be made. So Reagan is saying, essentially, I felt it didn't scour. And then he said, "But then I got a call. Frank Sinatra called me." And Frank said, "Ronnie, you got to feel good. The American president said the right things." And it was very good. And that made him feel better. He admired, I think he loved Frank Sinatra. Nancy loved Frank Sinatra. But more than that, they respected his professionalism and his ability to read the moment and his intelligence. And he didn't call after every speech. So if Frank called and he gave you a good review, baby, you just got a good review. So Reagan felt better about it and told me, and then I just thought, oh, good. Oh, good. Well, that's over. The next thing. Do you know what I mean? There's another Rose Garden speech. So that's...
Well, are you responsible for H.W. Bush's kinder, gentler? Was that, were those your words?
I worked on that speech. That was George H.W. Bush's acceptance speech in New Orleans in 1988.
Is it true that Nancy Reagan, when she heard that, said, "A kinder, gentler what?"
I don't know. The way I heard it, it was big gossip at the time. The way I heard it was that she had said, "Kinder and gentler than what?" I have no idea if she said that. I never asked her if she said it, but it had the sound of her piercing intelligence. So I think maybe, but I never asked.
Peggy Noonan, how do you view your role as a
public writer?
I think it's challenging. I think it's maybe a little more challenging than it was, say, back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I'm a big reader of biographies, and there's a biography of a wonderful American columnist, Dorothy Thompson. Very important, steady mind, intelligent, incisive woman who was a key figure really in 1930s and 40s journalism. She caught on to Hitler pretty early, and she had a serious foreign affairs mind. So she was a big American columnist, New York based. And there's a wonderful biography of her called American Cassandra, whose author I can't think of at the moment. But when I read it, I can't help but compare the life of a modern columnist who is a woman to her life as a columnist. One of the things that's interesting about being a public viewer of things, an establisher of your thoughts in America now, is that if you put your name on it, which columnists by definition do, obviously, you are under a lot of internet pressure. You are so freely insulted and so often insulted and so grossly insulted. You are sometimes threatened. There are some people who get very excited if a woman has a view that is not like their view, that is in fact the opposite of their view. It's been interesting for some time. I mean, I really put a lot on the internet, and there's nothing to do about it. The internet is also helpful and fabulous. But it's been very interesting in the Trump era to be a public holder and sharer of information who is also a woman.
Your columns generate 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 comments by viewers every week. Do you read those comments, or do you do a
Sometimes
sampling?
I do. I really try to. People tell me I shouldn't, but I feel it's disrespectful not to.
It's like a conversation with you in a sense with these viewers. And here's a couple comments.
Oh dear.
Peggy Noonan is one of the few columnists whose writing I follow closely. She's either a liberal conservative or a conservative liberal. I'm never quite sure. I like her optimism and her full-throated defense of the democratic process. What I don't appreciate is her seeming inability to take a clear stand on much of anything. Did that one hurt? I won't read these others hurt.
That's so thoughtful, actually. I thought you were going to read some of the other ones.
No, I mean, this, like I said, this is like a conversation these viewers these readers are having with you.
Yeah.
You're called Peg, you're called Pegaloo.
Totally.
There's no Ms. Noonan in here or anything, but it's like a conversation.
I'm not sure I had ever really quite thought of it like that. Sometimes readers are very familiar with me. Sometimes there's a guy who writes in and says, "This is it, I will never read you again." And then he comes in 2 weeks later and he'll never read me again. Sometimes people say they've had enough of me, and somebody else will answer them back and say, "And yet here you are," which amuses me a lot. I hate the feeling I'm disappointing people. And the Trump folk who could see my early sympathy for his stands and for the need of somebody to break through this establishment, I came not to like him, and they were so disappointed. They're disappointed to this day, and sometimes very angry to this day. It's an odd thing. Also, an odd thing is that when you are a public thinker, speaker, writer, you get a base of readers. But if you are really trying to play it straight and give your honest views, your views will not always please your base. And if you continue to hold them, you are going to lose your base. And you'll wind up with another. It's the oddest thing. You know, I can tell sometimes my readers have changed. They all left me over, I was pretty tough at a certain point on George W. Bush and Iraq. I was sort of set off by his inaugural address in 2004 when he more or less doubled down on Iraq by saying we're going to sort of outlaw evil in the world, and I just blew my top. Man, my readers got so mad at me, they just beat my head in, and I know some of them stopped reading me. But then other people read me, and it was okay. And then I broke with the party on immigration and lost everybody again. So it's very interesting to realize there's two ways to play it. One is know that you have a base of readers, but be honest and be yourself and call it straight and let life happen and hope more readers come in when you lose some. The other is the worst thing you can do, whether you have a big radio show or a TV show or a big column, is to act like the Tribune of conservative consistency and hold on to your base, but privately you disagree with them. And you just check constantly to see where are they going. And then you declare where you stand, which conveniently enough is exactly where they're going. People do that a lot. I really don't like that.
Who's your favorite columnist?
Oh.
Or a favorite columnist?
Yeah, I read them all. I just, I read a lot. I read a lot of essayists. I read, in our paper, Bill McGurn, Dan Henninger. I read Ezra Klein. I read Ross Douthat, whose work I think is in the New York Times, whose work I think is serious and true in the sense that he believes what he is writing. I believe I'm getting his actual opinions. You can't feel that way with everybody. Ezra Klein does great work. Maureen Dowd does great work in her third or fourth decade of working at the Times. Tom Friedman, When the Mideast is on Fire, read Tom, see what he's saying. Those are just the people I'm thinking of at the moment.
From A Certain Idea of America, this is a column that was first printed in the Wall Street Journal on August 17th, 2017, against the Tear It Down movement. Quote, "And once the tearing down starts, there's no knowing where it will end. Edmund Burke famously said that we have a duty to the past, the present, and the future. In the minds of the tear-downers, only the present is important and only their higher morality."
I think when you tear down statues, you are thwarting and killing in the cradle future conversations that could be very helpful. What America should be doing now, it's a cliche to say it, but it's true. Don't be tearing down, be building more. Be building in different ways, but there's plenty to celebrate in this country. Many good, great women and men. Statues are a funny thing. When you're a little kid, you go with your mom or your pop or your aunt, and you're in the park and there's a statue, and you say, "What's that?" And she says, "Well, that's Robert E. Lee." "Who's that?" "Well, he was a general." "Well, that's enough for you when you're 5 or 6. Then you're 10 or 11 and say, "So Robert E. Lee, he was a great man, right?" And then an honest parent would say, "It's complicated." And then when you're 14, you have a serious talk about everything connected to that statue and connected to our history and the Civil War and its causes and its meaning and how he viewed it, and right and wrong, and you wind up at Appomattox. These are conversations that you can just have in life. You don't have them if the statues are taken down.
November 22nd, 2023. Give thanks for Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift is the person of the year, you write. She is the best thing that has happened to America in all of 2023.
Wasn't she a phenom? I thought the Eras Tour, I started keeping track of Taylor.
So you're a Swiftie.
Well, no, it's a little ironic. Her music is not my music. What she does is actually just not my thing. I don't really find her, actually I'm very interested in her, apart from what I wrote. She's so compelling. She's not the greatest dancer. She's not the greatest singer. She's not the greatest songwriter. But what she has through will and love for the whole thing and desire to bring herself forward becomes something big and magical. I love the kids who love her. I got a wonderful, after this column came out, I got a wonderful Taylor Swift bracelet from a little 11-year-old girl who said, "You appreciate Taylor. My parents showed me your column. You get it, so I wrote you this. So I put together, sewed this, I made you this." And it's a Taylor Swift bracelet that had her name and underneath my name. It was so touching and wonderful. Look, Taylor Swift is a phenom. You just got to hand it to her. She changes. What so struck me, well, a number of things did, but one is that she changed the economics of every town and city she went to. There was like an anti-depression, anti-inflation Taylor Swift boom wherever she went. Somebody I quoted said it was like, if she went to Cincinnati, it was like Cincinnati had 2 Super Bowls. That was the economic effect. So, huge economic impact through the Eras Tour, but other decisions like how she took on Scooter Braun and the production of her music and who gets the money. She kind of revolutionized the financial aspects of the music business. She made like $1 billion or $2 billion on this tour, but she gave everybody who worked with her a lot of money, like a big tip along the way. Like the Teamsters, the truck drivers who hauled the sets got $100,000. This is a phenom. This is just, yay, good, do this. So.
In A Certain Idea of America, you talk about sitting down at Purdue University with the former president there, Mitch Daniels, the former governor of Indiana, and he reminded you of a comment that you had made 30 plus years ago, that liberals in the media don't hate conservatives. And I think he was wondering if that was still true.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure I said that. It's the way I experienced the past. Look, I don't really, I'm a conservative. I've been a conservative for a very long time. I've been in media for a very long time. I do not think those on the left or non-conservatives or liberals hate conservatives so much as very unconsciously they patronize them. They just do. They patronize them. Now, if you're going to patronize somebody, it should be from a great height, a great intellectual height or moral height. I would rather not be patronized by people who do not have that height. If you are a conservative, you are familiar with the concept of being patronized by your inferiors. Every conservative everywhere has this feeling. And it contributed to Donald Trump. How about that?
July 3, 2019. Again, another column that's in A Certain Idea of America. A Continuing Miracle is the name of the column. We are a people that has experienced something epic together. We were given this brilliant, beautiful thing, this new arrangement, a political invention, based on the assumption that we were all equal, that where you start doesn't dictate where you wind up. I love America because it's where the miracle is. I read that because in this column in the book, you talk about 3 books that I wanted to ask you about. We've only got a few minutes left. E.B. White on Democracy.
Yeah.
Amy and Leon Cass and Diana Schaub, So Proudly We Hail.
Yeah.
David McCullough, The Pioneers.
Yeah. Oh, they're all wonderful. One is The Orrin Cass one is a compendium of the great things that have been written and said about America. The David McCullough is a fabulous book about the founding of Ohio, which in the 18th century was the Ohio. That's what it was called. And it was founded by New Englanders who wanted to take this beautiful, unspoiled by humans place and make it into a kind of Athenian, democratic, beautiful place. And E.B. White's thoughts on democracy, John Meacham said in a recent book, FDR used to like to read E.B. White on the subject of democracy and how it was the suspicion that more than half of the people get it right more than half of the time. And FDR liked to read that aloud, apparently to friends, and then say, "Them's my feelings exactly." I sort of think that the idea, I was very lucky in that I came into life and entered life in an America that had respect for itself and some regard for itself, but some respect and so not bad pride, some bad pride, but some good pride. We had won wars. We had baseball, we had Hollywood movies, we had Wall Street, we had freedom. We had some things going on here. So there's kind of a pride, you know. We've got the Ford factory at Red Rouge and it makes cars and everyone can buy them. I was so lucky to have come from a turbulent background into an America that had a good sense of itself, and I feel for kids now, because they are not going forth at age 8 and 10 into an America that has a good sense of itself, but has a greater sense of not realism and reckoning, but shame, you know? And nothing good is built on shame. So I worry about that, and I find myself, as I get older, writing more about the things that we can appreciate and hold on to and shine up and bring forward into the future, but also just a sense, appreciate this place, love it, make it better. But it is lovable, it is worthy of your respect, and it's worthy of your protectiveness.
If somebody reads declarations in the Saturday Wall Street Journal every week, could they come away with the idea that Peggy Noonan views the American dream and the U.S. as best understood as a continuing project?
Sure. Why not? Let's hope it is. We would like it to continue for a long time into the future. It's called the American experiment. I never quite think of it that way, but sure, it's an experiment too. But keep it going. It is a good thing.
Your first book came out in '86, I believe, What I Saw at the Revolution.
1990.
1990. Most recent is A Certain Idea of America. Collection of columns. What's the lifespan of a column?
Well, I hope forever. The lifespan of a column, I don't know. If somebody reading it, it enters their head or their heart, or themselves a little bit, a column goes a long time. Or maybe it's just a column about what happened on Friday, and by Saturday it's over. You never quite know.
How many words do you get per week?
1,230. I happen to know, because I try very hard.
Seriously, 1,230?
Yes, and it's hard for me. I write 4,000 or 5,000 words. I cut a column out of that. So I'm very conscious of it. But it's only that long. It's long for a column, but it's because I'm in the Saturday paper, which is a sort of more relaxed, easier, slightly more room sort of experience.
What do you think of that placement in the Saturday Journal?
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's in the Wall Street Journal, so you have Wall Street Journal readers, but you have them on Saturday morning when everybody's relaxed and having a cup of coffee. And it's nice, and they write to me. By now, been around so long, people have my email address. I mean, my original AOL address, which I still have, and they write to me there and give me their opinion and agree or disagree.
Can you be anonymous on the streets of New York?
Yes, often, although it's the best of both worlds. Movie fame is the kind of mega fame you cannot escape. Television fame is a kind of mega fame. If you are a writer in a newspaper or in a magazine and you'll show up sometimes on talk shows, people will often recognize you, but it's not mega. It's not like seeing a movie star, so nobody bothers you. And the people who do come up and say hello are normally just longtime readers. And you have fabulous conversations with them. And once I was walking with my son in Central Park on a pretty Sunday in the spring or summer, and somebody came by and talked to me about my work and said, I'm so glad you do what you do. We had a lovely conversation. The man moved on. And my son looked at me and said, Mom, do you mind when that happens? And I said, I worked very hard so that would happen. I really like it. It's a really good thing. So,
Peggy Noonan, A Certain Idea of America, Selected Writings, Wall Street Journal columnist, has been our guest on Q&A.
Thank you, Peter, very much.
And thanks for being with us on this Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. Next week, which is Thanksgiving weekend, we will be re-airing a previous Q&A. Jack Werfel grew up in Nazi Germany. He was both Jewish and a member of the Hitler Youth. That's next weekend on the Q&A podcast.